It was 10 years ago, this winter, that I experienced professionally the most stressful month of my life. I was a young physician before entering seminary, and in my final year of training as a medical resident here in the city, a capstone rotation that all residents were required to go through was serving in the role of what was called the triage resident. The job of the triage resident is to move around the hospital evaluating patients who had become medically unstable. And after an evaluation, it was the triage resident's job to determine whether a patient needed to go to the intensive care unit, to the ICU, where the sickest patients received care. Each time my pager went off, I could be quite confident I was headed towards a crisis. But evaluating sick patients wasn't actually the most stressful part of the job. We had been well trained by this point to know who needed the ICU and who didn't. The stress came after we'd made the determination and began to look for an available ICU bed. Now, this was long before the COVID pandemic, but it was not uncommon in our hospital for us to be at near full capacity. So ICU beds could often be in short supply. And so I would call one of the ICUs at our medical center, and there were three words I would pray to not hear from the doctor or nurse in charge of the unit. And those words were, "There's no room." As the triage resident, "there's no room" meant that we had a lot more work to do. We would call more units in the hospital. We would call our physician colleagues, finding out if they had any space where they were. We would negotiate with charge nurses whether they could free up a bed. And we worked fast, sometimes running around the hospital if we had to, for what sometimes seemed like an impossible task, finding space for these patients in need. And then, somehow, even when the odds seemed stacked against us, a doctor or nurse, often a nurse, would call and would say that they had found a way to make room for that patient on their unit. Sometimes the circumstances were not ideal. Sometimes the bed was very far from where the patient was at present, or wasn't going to be ready for a couple hours, but there was a bed, and the patient would receive the care that they needed. And this often happened because a colleague gave the situation another look, or relied on some resourcefulness on their team, or just showed immense generosity, making space for someone in need. And for me, there was no feeling in the world like the relief of knowing that someone had found a way. For this patient in danger, this space, this bed, was the beginning of hope for recovery. Luke's gospel does not tell us much about how Mary and Joseph came to this manger. We only know that a traditional guest room was not made available to them. In tonight's musical reflection on the Nativity, entitled Miracle, that preceded this Mass, St. Paul's resident composer J. O'Connor Navarro imagines Mary and Joseph being confronted by a group of Bethlehem townspeople who cry out multiple times, "There's no room. There's no room for you here. No room for this family, no room for Christ," until one generous woman, the innkeeper's wife, as Miracle plays out, cries out, "Wait." And she pauses and she reconsiders the situation, and then she shows the Holy Family to this place, this manger from which Christ comes into the world. And I just love this interpretation. I love this idea of a woman who made room for Christ in a world that says there was no room. Because when she does, when she takes this second look, when she musters that compassion, a little more than those around her did, we discover God who is willing to work with even the most modest of places, bringing Christ into the world, even in this manger. There's a great lesson that I've learned from all those nurses I worked with years ago on those triage shifts, and now from this innkeeper's wife. When it comes to this Jesus Christ, something transformational happens when we make just a bit of room. Now, make no mistake, making space for God is probably not always easy for us. And I imagine most of us struggle at one point or another to make adequate room for Christ in our lives. We know that Christ is alive in each of our hearts. And yet, how many times, even with the people that we love most, does a conflict or an argument or a rift arise that leaves us saying, I'm sorry, I just don't have room for you right now. Or implicitly, I don't have room for the Christ in you in my life. Christmas, then, invites us to reconsider, to take that second look and ask ourselves, can I find a way to make some space? It might be something small, a phone call or a text or an email, or maybe just one generous question around the table this Christmas, just a beginning, a manger, in and through which God will grow something in those most important relationships in our lives, something transformational. Sometimes, even if we can see Christ alive in one another, we can't recognize or make very much space for him within ourselves. How many of us get down on ourselves, are critical of ourselves, especially now as we approach the end of the calendar year, saying, oh God, I wanted to do so much better this year. Show up more for my family, get the promotion, eat healthier, not to mention show more gratitude, be less judgmental, pray more, stew less. And as good and as important as some of these things are, there's just this tendency to be most tough on ourselves and forget our essential goodness, each of us as people made in the image of God. And then shut out Christ, the Christ in us, who always seeks more room, more space in our hearts. This night invites us to have a bit more compassion for ourselves, to make a bit more room for Christ, his peace, and his love, and let those things Christmas in us. This God who is so totally in love with you and with me asks us to just hold a little more space for that love, and then in this season, see what happens. In a quiet moment this Christmas, perhaps pause and acknowledge that Christ in you. I'll do it too. Maybe our prayer this Christmas is, God, thank you for coming and living in me. Here I am, making some space, that manger within me, from which you and I can grow something in this new year. Making space for Christ in our relationships and in ourselves, and finally, in our church. Don't we as a church sometimes need reminding about making space and welcoming the Christ in everyone? all people who desire to be with us and among us. One of the joys of being a priest with the Paulist Fathers is sharing our mission, which, rooted in the mission of Christ, says to all people, no matter where they are, where we are on our journey of faith, there is space for you here. There is room for you in this church. And we share that message in particular with those who, for whatever reason, may not feel particularly welcome in the church. I think in a particular way these days of people who have fled their home country because of violence and conflict and now seek to be with us here in the city. I think of young adults and others who may have left the church for whatever reason, or maybe weren't raised with any faith tradition at all, but are now looking again, open to a new spiritual home. And I think of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and beyond Catholics and the many gifts and perspective they bring to our church. And in each of these instances, the message is the same. Oh, there is room for you. For the Christ in you to be with us. We as church need you, and we must make space for that Christ in one another. Through your presence and gifts, something begins in us together. We grow into a body more alive, more holy because of you. This Christmas, don't let anyone ever tell you there's no room. Don't let anyone tell you there's no room in your heart, in your relationships, and in this church for Christ to enter and do something new. Begin a journey that leads all the way to new life. At the end of those triage shifts, before I went home, I often found it meaningful to go and check on patients that I had met during the course of the night. And even when we'd struggle to find that bed initially, by morning, almost inevitably, you could begin to see something change. Sometimes there was, praise God, evidence of early recovery. Sometimes the patient simply had had a chance to finally rest. Always, a new chapter was beginning. All because someone had made space. There is just so much that is possible when we make room for God. The wonder of what God does with our humblest, smallest beginnings, just opening a space, the manger of our lives. The great story that can unfold, God with us, when we make that space, that great story, that transformation, that new life, that is our joy on this day. That is what we rightly call a miracle.